The wind sweeping through the Wyoming Territory in the winter of 1876 carried the scent of pine, wood smoke, and the ugly stench of human cruelty. In the mud-choked square of Red Bluffs, the townspeople gathered not for a hanging, but for a spectacle far more degrading. Inside a rusted iron holding cage, typically reserved for rabid wolves or condemned outlaws, sat Beatrice Montgomery. Standing 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to carry a yearling calf, she was a giant of a woman, feared and despised, accused of crushing her husband to death. The jeering crowd threw frozen mud at the bars, waiting for the debt auction to begin. But the mocking laughter died in their throats the moment the heavy, deliberate boots of Sophia Caldwell, the ghost of the Wind River Mountains, stepped into the square. History books often sanitize the harsh realities of the frontier, painting the West as a place of golden opportunity and rugged heroism. But in the mining camp of Red Bluffs, survival was a brutal currency, and justice was whatever the man with the biggest guns said it was. Sheriff Elias Denton was that man. He ran the town, the saloon, and the ledgers of every desperate prospector who owed him money. Arthur Montgomery had been one of those men, a frail, desperate dreamer. Arthur had married Beatrice not out of love, but because a woman of her immense size and staggering strength could plow a field and haul timber like two grown men. Beatrice, orphaned young and mocked her entire life for her towering 6'4" frame and broad, muscular build, had accepted the marriage as her only escape from a life of destitution. She had been a loyal, fiercely protective wife. Yet, when Arthur was found at the bottom of a ravine with his neck snapped, the town didn't look for outlaws. They looked at the giant woman who lived with him. She broke him like a twig, the whispers went. A monster of a woman, a freak of nature. Without proof, Sheriff Denton couldn't legally hang her, but he could do something far more profitable. Arthur had died owing Denton a staggering $800 in gambling and supply debts. Under a twisted interpretation of territorial law, Denton seized the Montgomery property and placed Beatrice on the debt auction block to work off her late husband's arrears. They didn't just put her on a stage. Denton, knowing the town's morbid fascination and fear of her size, had his deputies lock Beatrice in a heavy iron transport cage in the center of the muddy thoroughfare. For 3 days, she sat there. The December cold seeped into her bones, her only protection a frayed wool blanket. Her dark, heavy hair was matted, her face bruised from the stones and ice chunks thrown by drunken miners. Yet, Beatrice did not weep. She sat with a terrifying, stoic dignity, her massive hands resting quietly in her lap, her dark eyes staring straight through the men who came to gawk at the giant widow. On the morning of the auction, a foul-smelling crowd surrounded the cage. Jebediah Croft, a ruthless labor contractor from the rail lines, stood beside Denton, looking at Beatrice like she was a draft horse. "I'll start the bidding at $50 for the beast," Croft sneered, spitting tobacco juice onto the hem of Beatrice's torn skirt. "She's big enough to lay rail ties, assuming she don't try to crush my skull in my sleep." Laughter erupted through the crowd. Men began shouting out insulting bids. "55! I need a new mule for the plow. 60! Though I'd rather sleep with a grizzly bear." Inside the cage, Beatrice closed her eyes, preparing herself for a life of chained labor. She knew her life was effectively over. Then, the laughter stopped. It didn't fade. It was cut off as abruptly as a blown-out lantern. The crowd parted, men stepping back into the mud, pulling their hats down low. Stepping through the parted sea of townspeople was Sophia Caldwell. Sophia was a man spoken of mostly in hushed rumors. He lived high up in the treacherous peaks of the Wind River Range, a solitary trapper, tracker, and prospector who came down to civilization perhaps twice a year. He was a towering figure himself, clad in a heavy buffalo hide coat, his face weathered by ice and sun, his jaw obscured by a thick, dark beard. Slung over his shoulder was a custom-tooled Sharps rifle, and strapped to his hip was a heavy Colt revolver that looked worn from use, not just for show. He didn't look at the crowd. His pale, icy blue eyes were fixed entirely on the iron cage. Sheriff Denton's smug smile faltered. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward to block the mountain man's path. "Caldwell, ain't expected you before the spring thaw. We're in the middle of official town business here. Debt auction." Sophia didn't stop until he was inches from the cage bars. He looked down at Beatrice. Beatrice looked back up at him. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a monster under a man's gaze. Sophia wasn't looking at her with fear or disgust or morbid curiosity. He was looking at her with a quiet, burning intensity. "What's the debt?" Sophia's voice was like gravel grinding under a wagon wheel, deep and resonant. Denton scoffed, trying to regain his authority. $800. More money than a feral mountain hermit sees in 10 lifetimes. Now step back. Caldwell Croft here has the high bid at... Sophia reached inside his heavy coat. He produced a worn leather pouch, heavy and bulging, and tossed it. The pouch hit the wooden auction block with a deafening thud, splitting slightly at the seam. A gasp echoed through the crowd as raw, uncut gold nuggets, some the size of walnuts, spilled out, glittering dully under the overcast winter sky. "There's $1,500 in raw gold there," Sophia said, not even looking at the sheriff. "Her debt is paid. The rest is for her property deed." Denton stared at the gold, his eyes wide with greed, but his pride was stung. "You can't just buy a killer, Caldwell. She's a dangerous woman. She murdered Arthur." Sophia finally turned his gaze to the sheriff. The sheer, predatory coldness in the mountain man's eyes made Denton take an involuntary step backward. If she wanted him dead, Denton, she wouldn't have thrown him off a ravine, Sophia said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. She would have torn him in half in his own parlor. We both know Arthur didn't fall. And we both know why. Denton's face went pale. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the gold, then back to Sophia. "Unlock it," Denton muttered to his deputy, tossing him the iron keys. The heavy padlock clicked, and the iron door squealed open. Beatrice didn't move at first. She looked at the open door, then up at the mountain man. Sophia took off his thick leather gloves, reached out, and offered her his bare hand. "Come on out, Mrs. Montgomery," Sophia said gently. "You've sat in the cold long enough." Beatrice hesitated, then placed her massive, bruised hand inside his. Sophia didn't flinch at her size or the rough calluses on her palms. He stepped back, giving her room as she ducked her head and stepped out of the cage, towering over the surrounding men. She stood at her full, imposing height, dwarfing Sheriff Denton and the others. But beside Sophia, who stood nearly 6'3" himself, she finally looked like a human being, not a circus attraction. "Get your horse," Sophia told her quietly. "We're leaving." The ride up the mountain was agonizingly tense. Beatrice rode her sturdy draft horse in silence, following the tracks of Sophia's massive roan stallion. The snow grew deeper, the air thinner, and the pines thicker as they ascended into the jagged, solitary wilderness. Beatrice's mind raced with dark thoughts. Why would a hermit pay a king's ransom for her? Was she to be his pack mule, a slave to chop his wood and haul his traps? Or worse, had he bought her for some twisted, solitary amusement? She knew what men were capable of when there were no laws to stop them. She tightened her grip on the reins, promising herself that if he laid a violent hand on her, she would fight him, even if it meant dying in the snow. By nightfall, they reached his homestead. It wasn't the crude, filthy hovel she expected. It was a large, meticulously constructed log cabin, built strong enough to withstand an avalanche. Inside, it was warm, smelling of cedar, dried herbs, and oiled leather. Sophia didn't order her to the hearth or point her to a broom. Instead, he took her frozen coat, hung it up, and motioned for her to sit in a heavy wooden chair draped in bear fur. He stoked the fire, heated a kettle, and within 30 minutes, set a cast-iron plate of hot venison stew and thick bread in front of her. Beatrice stared at the food, then at him. Why? She finally spoke.
This story
her
was
voice
posted on the
raspy from
channel The
disuse,
Rusty Saddle.
deep and
Please do
cautious.
not repost
Why
it in
did
any
you
form.
pay that much gold for a woman you don't know? I won't be a slave, Mr. Caldwell. I'll work hard, but I'll not be beaten or treated like a dog. Sophia sat across from her, pouring himself a mug of black coffee. He looked at her over the rim, his expression softening slightly. I didn't buy a slave, Beatrice, he said, and I don't intend to treat you like a dog. I bought your debt because I needed to get you out of Denton's hands before he killed you, and I brought you here because I have a proposition for you. He set his mug down, leaning forward. I want you to be my bride, legally bound, papers signed by the circuit judge. Beatrice froze, the spoon stopping halfway to her mouth. She let out a harsh, bitter laugh, the sound devoid of any joy. A bride? Look at me, Mr. Caldwell. I am a freak. I'm taller than most men, broader than a blacksmith. Men don't take wives like me unless they're blind or deranged. I am neither, Sophia replied evenly. I've watched you for 2 years when I came down for supplies. I saw how you handled that plow when Arthur was too drunk to stand. I saw you carry 200 pounds of feed on your shoulders without breaking a sweat. I saw how you carried yourself with dignity when those town fools mocked you. I don't want a fragile porcelain doll who will freeze to death in her first mountain winter. I want a partner, an equal, someone strong enough to survive this life. Beatrice's chest tightened. No one had ever spoken of her size as an asset of value, only as a curse. But why marriage? You bought my freedom. I owe you. I could just be your partner. Sophia's eyes darkened, the true twist of the tale coming to the surface. Because of Arthur. Before Arthur died, he came up this mountain. He was terrified. He had found something on the edge of your property line down in the valley. A silver vein. A massive one. Untouched. Buried deep under the limestone. Beatrice's eyes widened. Arthur found silver? Yes. Sophia nodded grimly. And he made the mistake of telling Sheriff Denton in an attempt to clear his gambling debts. Denton realized that if Arthur died, the bank which Denton controls could seize the property and the silver. Denton's men threw Arthur off that ravine. Sophia reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket. Beatrice gasped. It was her locket, the one Arthur had taken to town to pawn the week he died. Arthur hid the exact coordinates of the strike inside the backing of this locket, Sophia explained, handing it to her. He gave it to me before he went back down, told me to keep it safe. But here's the problem, Beatrice. Territorial law says that a widow's seized property can be reclaimed if she marries a man who can pay off the outstanding debt and file a joint claim within 30 days. He looked her dead in the eye. Denton thinks he won. But he doesn't know I bought your land deed today along with your debt. If you marry me, we file the claim jointly. The silver is legally ours. Denton can't touch it, and he can't touch you. We take the wealth. We destroy Denton's grip on that town, and we split it down the middle. Beatrice looked at the locket in her massive hands, the realization crashing over her. Sophia wasn't just offering her safety. He was offering her vengeance. He was offering her a chance to ruin the men who had locked her in a cage like an animal. She looked up at the rugged mountain man, the firelight reflecting in her dark eyes. And what happens after we get the silver, Sophia? What becomes of this marriage? Sophia held her gaze, a rare, faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. That, Mrs. Montgomery, will be entirely up to you. The territorial law was clear. A widow had 30 days to file a joint claim with a new husband to reclaim seized property. With the brutal Wyoming winter setting in, a 30-day window was a death sentence for most attempting to travel. But Sophia Caldwell and Beatrice Montgomery were not most people. 3 days after Sophia purchased her freedom, they packed the horses and began the treacherous trek toward South Pass City, where the nearest circuit judge resided. The journey was punishing. A blinding whiteout caught them halfway through the pass, burying the trail in waist-deep drifts. when a massive, frost-hollowed pine collapsed across the narrow ridge trail, blocking their only path forward. Sophia began unhitching the ropes to rig a pulley system with the horses. The footing was dangerously slick, and a panicked horse could easily slide over the sheer drop. "Save the ropes," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the howling wind. Before Sophia could stop her, Beatrice dismounted. She waded into the freezing snow, planting her heavy leather boots against the rock face. She wrapped her massive, thickly muscled arms around the rough bark of the fallen timber. With a guttural shout that rivaled the roaring wind, she drove her legs into the snow, the heavy wool of her coat straining across her broad shoulders. The massive tree groaned, shifted, and then rolled over the edge, crashing into the abyss below. Sophia stood frozen, snow swirling around him, staring at the woman he had bought from a cage. There was no fear in his icy blue eyes, only profound, unmasked awe. They reached South Pass City, half frozen but alive. Judge Horatio Finch, a tired, whiskey-soaked man, blinked in astonishment as the towering woman and the fearsome mountain man stood in his cramped parlor. He stammered through the vows, clearly intimidated by the sheer physical presence of the couple before him. When he pronounced them husband and wife, there was no celebratory kiss, only the scratch of a pen on a marriage certificate. Beatrice Montgomery was now Beatrice Caldwell. Back at the mountain cabin, the dynamic shifted. The piece of paper was meant to be a business arrangement, a shield against Sheriff Denton. But the isolation of the long winter months forced a different kind of reckoning. One late evening, as a blizzard battered the log walls, Beatrice sat near the hearth in a simple linen shift, rubbing a pungent pine tar salve into her shoulder, which still ached from moving the fallen tree. She struggled to reach a deep knot near her shoulder blade. Quietly, Sophia stepped into the firelight. He didn't ask. He simply took the tin of salve from her hand. His fingers, rough from years of trapping, were surprisingly gentle as they pressed into the dense, hardened muscles of her back. Beatrice stiffened. "I'm not built like the women in the dime novels, Sophia," she murmured, a trace of old shame coloring her deep voice. "I'm built like a plow horse, all scars and heavy bone." Sophia stopped rubbing but didn't remove his hands. He traced a faded, jagged scar near her collarbone, a remnant of a beating she'd taken defending Arthur from a drunken miner years ago. "I've spent 10 years surviving the harshest country God ever created," Sophia said, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "I know the difference between something fragile that looks pretty until the wind blows, and something magnificent that can withstand the storm. You are the most beautiful, formidable creature I have ever laid eyes on, Beatrice." She turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his pale blue ones. For the first time, she saw a raw, unmistakable hunger in a man's eyes that had nothing to do with labor or exploitation. He pulled her gently toward him, and when he kissed her, it wasn't the tentative, fearful peck she had known in her first marriage. It was a fiercely passionate claim. That night, on a bed of thick bear pelts, the marriage ceased to be a mere legal arrangement. Beatrice finally discovered what it meant to be touched with reverence, worshipped not in spite of her monumental strength, but because of it. When the spring thaw finally broke the mountain's icy grip in April, the snowmelt rushed down into the valleys, signaling that it was time to move. During the winter, they had pried open the silver locket Arthur had left behind. Tucked behind a faded miniature portrait was a tiny, folded piece of vellum. It contained precise surveying coordinates and a crude map pointing to a limestone cavern at the far eastern edge of Beatrice's old property, a sector bordering a dried-out creek bed. Before they could blindside Denton legally, they needed undeniable proof of the strike. Under the cover of a moonless night, Sophia and Beatrice rode down into the valley, tethering their horses a mile from the property line. The land was currently heavily guarded by Denton's hired thugs, who were waiting for the ground to thaw enough to start tearing the valley apart. Moving like ghosts through the shadows, they bypassed a pair of drunken sentries and descended into the ravine where Arthur had met his end. Following the map, They waded through waist-deep, freezing creek water into a concealed
This story was
fissure in
posted on the
limestone.
channel The Rusty
Lighting
Saddle.
a hooded
Please do not
lantern,
repost it in any
Sophia
form.
held the flame aloft. Beatrice gasped. Veins of pure, wire silver spider webbed across the cavern walls, glittering like trapped lightning in the dim light. It wasn't just a strike. It was a mother lode, wealthy enough to buy the entire town of Red Bluffs 10 times over. Sophia used a hardened steel chisel to chip away 3 heavy chunks of the ore, shoving them into his canvas satchel. "Now," Sophia whispered, a dangerous smile crossing his face, "we spring the trap." The next morning, Red Bluffs was shaken from its muddy, hungover stupor by the sound of heavy hooves. The townspeople, who had watched Beatrice humiliated in a cage months prior, now stopped and stared in stunned silence. Beatrice rode her horse with a straight spine, dressed not in rags, but in a tailored, dark wool riding habit that accentuated her towering, powerful frame. At her side rode Sophia Caldwell, a Winchester rifle resting casually across his saddle pommel. She did not look away from the stairs. She met the eyes of the men who had thrown mud at her, watching them shrink back onto the boardwalks in fear. They bypassed the sheriff's office entirely and rode straight to the federal assay office. Thaddeus Bowen, the territorial assayer, was a nervous, bespectacled man who despised Sheriff Denton but lacked the spine to oppose him. Sophia slammed the canvas satchel onto Bowen's desk, followed by the marriage certificate and the joint property claim. "I need an official assay on this ore, Mr. Bowen," Sophia said smoothly. "And I need this joint claim stamped and filed under the Federal Mining Act." Today, Bowen inspected the rocks, his eyes bugging out behind his spectacles. "Good God, this is pure. Where did you find this?" "On my wife's land," Sophia replied. Just as Bowen reached for his official federal stamp, the door to the office was kicked open. Sheriff Elias Denton stood in the doorway, flanked by his enforcer, Jebediah Croft, and 2 deputies, with their hands resting on their holstered revolvers. Denton's face was purple with rage. Word of their arrival had reached him fast. "That property belongs to the town bank, Caldwell," Denton spat, stepping into the room. "And that ore belongs to me. Hand over the paperwork, Bowen, or I'll have you arrested for aiding a known killer." Beatrice stood up. She rose to her full 6'4" height, dwarfing Denton. She didn't reach for a gun. She simply stepped between Denton and the assayer's desk, an immovable wall of bone and muscle. "The debt was paid in full, Elias," Beatrice said, her voice echoing like a tolling bell in the small office. "The marriage was filed within 30 days. By territorial law, the land is mine. The silver is mine. Law?" Denton laughed, a harsh, desperate sound, realizing the millions of dollars slipping through his fingers. "I am the law in Red Bluffs. Croft, take that satchel." Croft lunged forward, reaching for the silver. Before his hand could touch the canvas, Beatrice moved with a terrifying, explosive speed. She grabbed Croft by the lapels of his heavy coat, lifted the 200-pound man clean off his feet, and threw him backward through the glass window of the assay office. The shattering of glass and Croft's scream silenced the room. Sophia casually cocked the hammer of his Colt, pointing it directly at Denton's chest. "You're a bit late, Sheriff," Sophia said, his voice deadly calm. "We didn't just come here to file. 3 days ago, I paid a Pony Express rider to deliver a copy of this map, the ore analysis from a chemist in South Pass, and our legal claim directly to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. If you kill us, or if you try to take that land, the United States Cavalry will ride into Red Bluffs and hang you for claim jumping." Denton stared at Sophia, the color draining from his face as the realization hit him. He had been completely outplayed. He was trapped in a web of his own greed, legally bound and outgunned. But as Denton backed out of the office, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred, Sophia knew the sheriff wouldn't go down without a bloodbath. The law had tied Denton's hands, But desperate men rarely cared about the law when millions of dollars were on the line. Sheriff Elias Denton was not a man who surrendered gracefully to the law, and he certainly was not a man who would let a fortune in raw silver slip through his fingers without a bloodbath. The moment Sophia Caldwell and his towering bride walked out of the federal assay office, leaving a shattered window and a broken enforcer in their wake, the fragile illusion of order in Red Bluffs evaporated. Denton marched straight back to his saloon, kicking the heavy batwing doors shut and locking them against the prying eyes of the terrified townspeople. He stormed behind the mahogany bar, grabbed a bottle of cheap, biting rye whiskey, and poured himself a glass with trembling, rage-fueled hands. He downed it in a single burning gulp, then hurled the glass against the wall, where it shattered into 100 glittering pieces. He summoned his worst men. They filed into the dim, smoke-stained room, a collection of hardened killers, desperate prospectors, and ruthless rail hands who owed Denton their livelihoods. Among them was Jebediah Croft, his face bruised a sickly purple and his chest tightly bound with soiled bandages after Beatrice had thrown him bodily through the assay office window. Croft's eyes burned with a venomous, humiliated fury. "The federal marshal from Cheyenne won't be here for at least 3 days," Denton told his men, slamming his heavy fists onto the bar to command their attention. "Caldwell and the giant freak are heading back up to their mountain cabin. We do not let them make it to the high country. We ambush them at the ravine. We bury them in the dirt right next to Arthur, collapse the cavern entrance to hide the strike, and when the marshal finally arrives, we tell him they skipped the territory to avoid a fraud charge. The silver is ours. Millions of dollars, boys. But only if they die tonight." Denton's fatal mistake, however, was assuming Sophia Caldwell thought like a civilized man who trusted the slow gears of the law to protect him. Sophia had survived a decade in the brutal, unforgiving peaks of the Wind River Range. He thought like a predator, and he knew a cornered animal was the most dangerous creature on earth. Sophia knew Denton wouldn't wait for the cavalry. As he and Beatrice rode out of Red Bluffs, the townsfolk peering out from behind drawn curtains, Sophia did not take the main wagon trail back to the high country. Instead, the moment they hit the timberline, they doubled back through the dense, freezing pine forests, their horses breaking a fresh trail through the deep powder. They circled deliberately toward the limestone cavern on Beatrice's property. If Denton wanted the silver, he would have to come to the source, and he would have to come through the ravine where Arthur Montgomery had been murdered. "He'll bring a posse," Sophia said, dismounting as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. He pulled his heavy, custom-tooled Sharps rifle from its leather scabbard, checking the breech with a practiced, lethal efficiency. He then reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a lever-action Winchester repeater, passing it to Beatrice, along with a heavy leather bandolier of cartridges. "They'll try to bottleneck us in the ravine," Sophia continued, his pale blue eyes scanning the darkening gorge. "Denton thinks we'll hide in the cavern to protect the strike. We won't. We take the high ground. We make them bleed for every inch of rock." Beatrice took the Winchester. In her massive, calloused hands, the heavy, formidable firearm looked almost like a child's plaything. She checked the lever action, her dark eyes locking onto the oiled steel. Her face was a mask of pure iron resolve. "I spent my entire life keeping my head down, Sophia," Beatrice murmured, her deep voice vibrating with years of suppressed anger, "hoping men like Denton and Croft would just leave me be. I let them treat me like a beast of burden because I thought that was all I was worth." Sophia paused in his preparations. He stepped close to her in the fading, freezing twilight. He reached up, his rough, leather-gloved hand gently cupping her strong jawline. He looked at her with an intensity that chased the winter chill from her bones. "You don't ever have to look down again, Beatrice," Sophia said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You are the queen of this mountain. You are my wife. And tonight, we remind every single one of those cowards why they used to fear you. They spent the agonizingly cold night rigging the narrow, treacherous entrance of the ravine. Sophia, a master trapper who had caught everything from timber wolves to grizzly bears, set to work with ruthless ingenuity.
This story was
He
posted
strung
on the channel
tripwires
The
made of
Rusty
fine,
Saddle.
dark
Please do not
gut
repost
line
it in
across
any
the
form.
frozen creek bed, attaching them to deadfall traps, massive, frost-hollowed pine logs suspended by ropes in the upper canopy. While Sophia worked the timber, Beatrice fortified the ridge. She used her staggering, monumental strength to drag and roll massive limestone boulders, rocks that would normally require a team of mules and a block and tackle to move to the very edge of the cliff overlooking the trail. Sweating despite the freezing temperatures, she built a solid, impenetrable parapet that would shield them from returning fire. Just before dawn, the temperature plummeted, and a freezing, blinding fog rolled into the valley. It clung to the pines and filled the ravine like thick, gray cotton. The waiting was the hardest part. Beatrice knelt behind her barricade, the cold seeping through her wool coat, her thumb resting on the hammer of the Winchester. Then, she heard it. Through the dense, gray mist, the muffled sound of snapping twigs, the crunch of snow under heavy hooves, and the faint, metallic jingle of spurs echoed up the canyon walls. Denton and his men had arrived, moving blindly into the throat of the gorge. Sophia lay perfectly prone on the ridge, the heavy barrel of his Sharps rifle resting on a flat limestone outcrop. Beside him, Beatrice controlled her breathing, her heart pounding a heavy, steady rhythm against her ribs. 7 riders, Sophia whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind, his eyes tracking the dark, shifting shadows in the mist below. Croft is taking the left flank near the tree line. Denton is hanging back like the coward he is. Wait for them to cross the creek bed. Let them commit. The tension was suffocating. The lead rider, a hired gun wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, spurred his nervous horse forward. As the animal stepped into the freezing, rushing water of the creek, its front hoof snagged Sophia's concealed gut line. A deafening wooden crack echoed through the canyon like a cannon shot. A suspended deadfall log, weighing over 500 pounds, swung down from the timberline in a violent arc. It smashed into the lead rider with terrifying force, sweeping both the man and his screaming horse off the trail and sending them plunging into the freezing rapids below. "Ambush!" Croft screamed from the tree line, drawing his revolver and firing blindly up into the fog. "They're on the rocks, up high." Sophia did not blink. He exhaled a long, steady breath, sighted on the muzzle flashes below, and pulled the heavy trigger of the Sharps. The canyon roared. The .50 caliber slug tore through the fog with the sound of ripping canvas. It found a hired gun trying to draw his rifle, shattering his shoulder and spinning him violently out of his saddle. He hit the frozen mud and didn't move. Gunfire erupted from the valley floor in a chaotic frenzy. Bullets chipped the limestone around Beatrice and Sophia, whining through the frigid air and showering them in sharp rock dust. Beatrice stood up from behind her boulder barricade. She didn't flinch at the bullets snapping past her head. She leveled the Winchester solidly against her broad shoulder, sighted a man trying to flank them through the dense brush, and fired. The man dropped instantly with a cry of pain. She worked the lever with terrifying, mechanical speed, clack-bang, laying down a suppressing fire so heavy and devastatingly accurate that Denton's remaining men were firmly pinned in the freezing mud, unable to advance an inch. "Push up the right side," Denton bellowed from the safety of a massive, hollowed-out oak tree far behind his men. "Get above them! Kill the freak!" Hearing the command, 3 men, including a heavily bleeding but enraged Jebediah Croft, scrambled up the steep, jagged scree slope on the right side of the canyon, hoping to outflank the couple's fortified position. Sophia drew his Colt revolver, holding the main trail to keep the remaining pinned men down, while Beatrice turned her full attention to the climbers. She fired 3 more times, kicking up dirt and rock inches from Croft's boots, forcing him to dive behind a stump. Then, the hammer of the Winchester clicked on an empty chamber. She had run out of ammunition, and with the men rapidly ascending the loose rock, there was absolutely no time to reload. Croft crested the ridge, his face twisted in a bloody, triumphant snarl, his double-barreled shotgun raised and aimed directly at Beatrice's chest. "I'm gonna put you back in a cage, you giant freak," he roared, his finger tightening on the dual triggers. Beatrice did not reach for her pistol. She did not dive for cover. Instead, she reached down and grabbed the massive, 300-pound limestone boulder she had used to anchor the right side of her barricade. With a guttural roar that echoed louder than the gunfire, Beatrice deadlifted the colossal stone. The heavy wool of her coat tore at the seams from the impossible, explosive flex of her massive shoulders and back. She hoisted the boulder to her chest, took one step forward, and hurled it completely over the ledge. The massive rock plummeted downward, slamming into the treacherous scree slope just a few yards above where Croft and his two men were climbing. The tremendous impact triggered a catastrophic, localized landslide. Tons of loose limestone, ice, and frozen mud gave way instantly beneath the men's boots. Croft shrieked in absolute terror as the ground simply vanished beneath him. He fired his shotgun wildly into the sky as the avalanche took him, and his two hired guns, tumbling 50 feet down, the jagged, unforgiving cliffside, in a blinding cloud of dust and snow, burying them completely in the freezing creek bed below. The roar of the falling rock echoed through the canyon, and then, slowly, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ravine. The deafening roar of the localized avalanche finally ceased, leaving behind a suffocating cloud of pulverized limestone and freezing dust. The silence that followed was heavy and agonizing, broken only by the settling of loose scree and the distant, muffled groans of Jebediah Croft and his men, buried somewhere in the icy mud of the creek bed far below. Beatrice stood at the edge of the precipice, her chest heaving. The thick wool of her tailored coat was torn at the shoulder seams, unable to contain the sheer, explosive expansion of her back and shoulder muscles when she had deadlifted the massive boulder. She looked down at her massive, calloused hands. They were trembling, coated in gray rock dust and scraped raw, but she felt no pain. For the first time in her 32 years, the staggering, giant strength that had made her a pariah had been used not for grueling servitude, but to protect her own life and the life of the man who had bought her out of a cage. Beside her, Sophia Caldwell remained perfectly still. He didn't celebrate. The icy blue eyes of the mountain man scanned the settling dust, his senses dialed to the razor edge of a hunted wolf. He smoothly broke open the breech of his Sharps rifle, the metallic clack echoing sharply off the canyon walls, and slid a fresh, heavy brass cartridge into the chamber. "Denton?" Sophia called out, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the freezing Wyoming wind. "Your men are broken or dead. The claim is filed. It's over." There was no answer from the valley floor, only the haunting whistle of the wind through the pines. Then, the distinct, oily click of a revolver hammer cocking sounded directly behind them, not 10 feet away. Elias Denton had not stayed with his men. The cowardly sheriff had abandoned Croft the moment the gunfire grew heavy, using the distraction of Beatrice's suppressing fire to shimmy up a blind, frozen crevice on the far side of the ridge. He stood there now, his breathing ragged, his pristine badge covered in mud. His face was a mask of feral, cornered desperation, and his heavy Colt Peacemaker was aimed directly at the center of Sophia's back. "Drop the rifle, Caldwell," Denton panted, a manic, spit-flecked grin spreading across his face. "Drop it right now, or I'll put a .45 caliber slug straight through your spine. You won't even feel your legs when you hit the dirt." Sophia didn't flinch. He didn't turn around. Slowly, deliberately, he opened his hands, letting the heavy, custom-tooled Sharps rifle fall into the snow and dirt. Denton let out a harsh, wet laugh. "You thought you were so damn smart, mountain man. Riding into my town, throwing gold around, playing the hero for a freak of nature. But you're dying in the dirt today, just like Arthur did. The only difference is, I let my boys toss Arthur over the edge. I'm going to put you in the ground myself." At the mention of Arthur's name, the air on the ridge seemed to freeze solid. Beatrice, who had been standing slightly ahead of Sophia,
This story was posted
slowly
on the
turned
channel The
around.
Rusty Saddle.
Arthur didn't
Please do not
fall,
repost it in
Beatrice
any
said.
form.
Her deep, resonant voice wasn't laced with panic. It vibrated with a terrifying, absolute calm. Denton's wild eyes shifted to her, his gun hand trembling slightly as he took in her full, imposing 6'4" height. "No, he didn't fall, you giant bitch," Denton sneered, desperate to maintain control through cruelty. He squealed. "We hung him by his ankles over this very ravine, demanding the coordinates for the silver. Do you know what he did? He cried for you. A grown man, weeping and begging for his freakish monster of a wife to come save him. It was pathetic. When I realized he had hidden the map in that locket and tossed it, I cut the rope myself." Sophia's jaw tightened, his muscles coiling beneath his heavy buffalo coat. Waiting for the split second, Denton's attention wavered. But before Sophia could move, Beatrice stepped forward. "Stop right there!" Denton screamed, swinging the revolver to aim directly at Beatrice's broad chest. "Get on your knees. I put you in an iron cage once, and I'll put you in a pine box today." Beatrice did not kneel. She looked at the barrel of the gun, then up into the pathetic, terrified eyes of the man holding it. She remembered the freezing mud of Red Bluffs. She remembered the men throwing ice at her, the mocking laughter, the deep, hollow shame that had eaten at her soul for a lifetime. She took another heavy, deliberate step forward. "Shoot her!" Denton shrieked, his voice cracking under the sheer, overwhelming physical pressure of her advance. Beatrice took a third step. Denton squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening at such close range. A blossom of smoke and fire erupted from the barrel. Beatrice felt the sledgehammer impact of the bullet as it grazed her left side, tearing through the thick wool, ripping a trench through her corset, and slicing across her lower ribs. A spray of blood hit the snow. She grunted, her momentum stalling for a fraction of a second. Denton's eyes went wide with sheer horror. He had shot her center mass, and she hadn't gone down. Desperately, his thumbs scrambled to cock the hammer for a second shot. He never got the chance. Beatrice closed the gap with explosive, terrifying speed. Her massive right hand lashed out, clamping over Denton's forearm like a blacksmith's vice. She didn't just disarm him. She twisted her wrist with a brutal, unapologetic surge of strength. The sickening, wet snap of Denton's radius and ulna breaking echoed across the ridge. Denton's scream was high and shrill, like a wounded rabbit. The revolver dropped harmlessly into the snow. Beatrice didn't stop. She reached out with her uninjured left arm, grabbed a fistful of Denton's heavy leather coat, and hoisted him completely off the ground. She turned and slammed his back against the rough, frozen bark of a towering ponderosa pine. Denton dangled 2 feet in the air, his boots kicking uselessly at empty space. Beatrice held the 200-pound man pinned to the tree with a single arm, her knuckles white, her grip crushing his ribs. Blood from her gunshot wound dripped steadily onto the snow, but she ignored it, bringing her face inches from his. "You put me in an iron cage, Elias," she whispered. Her voice was no longer calm. It was the low, rumbling growl of a mountain predator. "You let them throw stones at me like I was a rabid dog. You stole my husband's life for silver, and you tried to strip me of every ounce of my humanity." "Please," Denton choked out. His face was rapidly turning purple as her massive forearm pressed against his sternum. Saliva mixed with blood dribbled down his chin. "Please, God, don't kill me." Beatrice stared at him. The rage burning in her chest was a living thing. It would be so easy. She could crush his ribcage into splinters. She could carry him to the edge of the ravine and drop him onto the jagged rocks, exactly where Arthur had died. He was a monster who deserved no mercy, and the wild frontier demanded blood for blood. She tightened her grip. Denton's eyes began to roll back in his head. "Beatrice, The single word cut through the red haze of her fury. It was spoken softly, evenly, without an ounce of command or fear. She turned her head slightly. Sophia was standing a few feet away, his pale blue eyes locked onto hers. He hadn't drawn his pistol. He wasn't rushing to stop her. He was simply looking at her with that same quiet, burning reverence he had shown her in the town square. "He's not worth the dirt on your boots, Beatrice," Sophia said, his voice a grounding anchor in the storm of her wrath. "If you crush him, you become what they always said you were. You're not a beast. You are my wife. And you have already won." Beatrice looked back at Denton, who was now weeping, a broken, pathetic shell of a tyrant. She felt the heavy, ragged scar on her shoulder, where Sophia had applied the salve. She felt the warmth of a man who loved her for her strength, not the fear of it. She exhaled a long, misty breath into the freezing air. The murderous tension drained from her massive shoulders. "You're right," Beatrice said, her voice dropping back to its deep, steady timbre. She looked Denton dead in the eye. "I am not a monster. I'm just the woman who broke you." She opened her hand. Denton crumpled to the snow-covered ground, sobbing violently, clutching his shattered arm to his chest as he gasped for air. Sophia walked over, pulling a length of heavy rawhide rope from his belt. He systematically bound Denton's good arm and legs, tying him securely to the base of the pine tree. Then, without a word, he turned his attention to Beatrice. He pulled off his leather glove, his rough fingers gently touching the torn, blood-soaked wool at her waist. "It's a graze," Beatrice said softly, looking down at him. "It caught the corset steel mostly." "I'm fine, Sophia." "Sit down," Sophia instructed, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. He guided her to sit on the boulder she hadn't thrown, tearing a strip of clean linen from his own shirt to bind her ribs tightly. "You took a bullet for me, Beatrice Caldwell?" "You bought me out of a cage," she replied, her dark eyes softening. "I'd say we're even." Sophia tied off the bandage, then leaned up and kissed her a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of cordite, dust, and profound relief. They spent the rest of the day and the freezing night guarding the ridge. They dragged the surviving, battered henchmen up from the creek bed, binding them next to their weeping sheriff. They built a small fire, sitting shoulder to shoulder beneath the vast, starlit Wyoming sky, listening to the crackle of the flames and the wind moving through the valley. By noon the following day, the rhythmic, organized thundering of heavy cavalry hoofbeats echoed up the canyon trail. United States Marshal Caleb Lavender rode into the clearing, flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal deputies from Cheyenne. Lavender, a stern man with a thick silver mustache and eyes that had seen decades of frontier violence, took in the scene. He looked at the shattered limestone barricades, the blood in the snow, the tied-up henchmen, and finally, Sheriff Elias Denton, broken and shivering against the pine tree. Lavender dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. Sophia handed him the assay documents, the signed property deed, and the federal claim paperwork that had been couriered ahead. The marshal reviewed the papers carefully, then looked up at Beatrice. He didn't look at her with fear or morbid curiosity. He looked at her with deep, unmasked respect. "Sheriff Denton has been running Red Bluffs like a private fiefdom for 6 years, Lavender said, folding the papers and tucking them into his coat. "We've known he was corrupt, but no one in that town had the spine to stand up to him, let alone survive an ambush to testify. You've done the territory a great service, Mrs. Caldwell. These men will hang in Cheyenne before the month is out." Marshal Lavender tipped the brim of his hat to her. "The silver claim is legally, irrevocably yours. The law protects it now." As the federal deputies hauled Denton and his men away, hoisting them over their saddles like sacks of flour, Sophia and Beatrice walked to the edge of the ridge. The winter sun was finally breaking through the heavy gray clouds, casting brilliant rays of golden light down into the valley, illuminating the entrance to the cavern that held millions in raw silver. Sophia wrapped his heavy arm around Beatrice's waist. She leaned her formidable weight against him, watching the lawmen ride away, taking the ghosts of her past with them. "We're rich, Sophia," Beatrice murmured, the reality finally setting in. Sophia looked up at his giant bride, the woman who had fought like a titan to protect him, the woman who had proven her humanity in the face of absolute cruelty. He smiled, a genuine, rare expression that reached his icy blue eyes. "We were rich the day you walked out of that cage, Beatrice," Sophia said softly. "The silver is just extra." The silver strike at Red Bluffs yielded over $2 million in its first 3 years. But Beatrice and Sophia never built a mansion in the muddy town that had scorned her. Instead, they sold the operation to an Eastern syndicate and bought 10,000 acres of pristine, untamed land.
This
in the
story
high
was
valleys
posted
of
on the
Montana
channel The Rusty
Territory.
Saddle. Please do
There,
not repost
they
it
built
in
a
any
sprawling
form.
horse ranch. Beatrice Caldwell, once mocked as a giant and paraded in a cage, became a legend of the frontier, a woman renowned not just for her staggering wealth, but for her immense heart, her formidable strength, and her unyielding partnership with the mountain man who had seen her true worth. They lived entirely on their own terms, bound by a love forged in ice, gunpowder, and an unbreakable respect. She was no longer a spectacle. She was the master of her own vast, beautiful world,